We are joined here today by David Sirota, who is the founder of the Daily Poster. David, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk mostly minimum wage today. You had an interesting scoop recently about the enemies of raising a minimum wage taking a victory lap after after it didn't get into the COVID relief package. How did you come across this, and what was the meaning of this to you?
So we got a tip from somebody inside a company called Inspire Brands. Inspire Brands is an umbrella organization that runs and owns a number of major fast food chains, including Jimmy John's and Arby's and Dunkin' Donuts. And what the tip was that the company, Inspire Brands, was telling its employees, was actually taking a victory lap with employees, saying that it had successfully defeated the Raise the Wage Act, successfully kept it out of the stimulus bill. And so it was a very explicit kind of spiking of the football to say to employees, look at what we did. We managed to prevent, in our low wage industry, we managed to prevent the federal government from raising the minimum wage to $15. And in addition to it, it was telling employees that it is now working hard to stop the so-called PRO Act, the bill, the Democratic legislation to make it easier for workers to join a union. So a very clear example of a low-wage employer proudly telling its employees that it is effectively trying to keep wages extremely low. Now, the other fun part of this story, I put fun in quotes, is that the owner of Inspire Brands, I mean, this is almost like something out of a cartoon. The owner of Inspire Brands, the majority investor, is a private equity firm named after an Ayn Rand character, Rourke Capital. So, I mean, if you were going to create a caricature out of this story, like a comic book version of this story, you would have an Ayn Rand character named private equity firm bragging to its employees that it had helped prevent the federal government from raising the starvation wage of its workers.
And when you say to its employees, I was assuming, and tell me if I'm right or not, that this went to the management and executive level, that they were not spiking the football in the face of their shift workers. Hey, welcome to your 7 a.m. shift. After you wash your hands, we got a great piece of news to share with you about what your company accomplished. Is that right? Or did that
Inspire Brands is the umbrella group, and so it's sort of the corporate management of the chains, and so it was essentially the government relations and lobbying branch of that company telling the rest of that sort of corporate umbrella organization, hey, look at what we did. We managed to stop the minimum wage. And if it isn't already obvious, it's worth saying that of course, many of the employees in the shift workers in the brands themselves at Jimmy John's, at Dunkin' Donuts, at Arby's are not being paid a $15 minimum wage. So essentially preventing that from happening boosts the profit of the chains, boosts the profits of the umbrella organization, boosts the profits of Rourke Capital.
Right, and if they were being paid $15 an hour at least, you'd see them lobbying for it. That's what you see companies do. If they're already doing something, then they're happy to lobby for the government to force their competitors to do it. The franchise question is interesting, and you get into that later in your piece when you talk about the PRO Act, which is the union reform legislation that's being discussed. And the Inspire talks about its fear of the new laws linkage between franchises, franchisees and the parent company. Because what a lot of people probably might not understand is, like, if you run one Subway shop, you're starving yourself. Like, you're the boss of that Subway, but you're probably going into debt. It's only the people that wind up owning several dozen of these chains that make any money. And it sounds like what they're nervous about is that the PRO Act would say, no, that's an exploitative relationship too. You can no longer have somebody that runs a franchise for you and just don't pay them. They work 120 hours a week, but they are effectively an employee, but not an employee under the law.
That's absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of implications for these corporate parent companies that what they're trying to do, what we've seen across industries, is corporate parent companies want to have their brands out there, want to reap all the benefits of having their brands out there, all the revenues. But then when it comes to workers organizing or franchisees pushing for their own rights, they want to say they have no responsibility. These are just, the workers at franchises are only employees of the individual franchise. They have no economic relationship with the corporate parent company. The franchisees supposedly are completely independent. They have no economic relationship with the corporate parent company. So they want to try to have it both ways, gain the revenue, but pretend they have no economic relationship with these franchisees and these workers for purposes of unionization, better pay, fair labor standards.
Right, and not just rake profits from them, but give them very specific instructions of how to run their businesses. How the seating is to be laid out, how long you microwave something, how long you deep fry something, what products you can sell, what price you can sell them at, what wages you ought to pay. The idea that they're independent, it's like, well, what part of this is independent other than the fact that you're not directly employed by this. And I think that franchisees, personally, I'd be curious for your take on this. I think people who run these franchises have a stronger political, moral, ethical, and pragmatic claim to employee status of these corporations than even a lot of gig workers. Like, somebody who drives for Uber 5 hours a week might only want to do one day. They might only want to do Saturday. And so now, of course, you'd say, well, okay, anybody under 40 or under 35 doesn't qualify for that. But there's nobody running a franchise that isn't throwing their entire heart and soul into that.
I completely agree. I totally agree. And look, this speaks to a larger issue of the relationship between employers and employees and the effort by employers to use misclassification to pretend that their employees, their workforce, isn't really their workforce. I mean, we have seen, as you mentioned, in the gig economy, but the franchise economy, if you will, is also a similar place where these big companies are playing around with, are trying to game essentially the classification system. What is an employee? What is a worker? Who is my actual workforce? And they're trying to game that so that they don't effectively have any responsibility to follow the laws. Granted, laws that haven't been updated in many, many years. The sort of old-fashioned laws that presumed a much more simple relationship between employer and employee. And the gig economy, I mean, that's a great example. I mean, there was a case a while ago, I'll probably sort of slightly get some of the details wrong, but where Uber was basically saying, these are not our employees, the ride sharing companies, these are not really our employees, they're all independent contractors. And then at one point, some of the employees said, well, if we're all independent contractors, but we're all being directed by your app, by the central data situation, by the app itself, then you're essentially creating price collusion and you're violating antitrust laws.
That's right.
Like, either we're your workers and you're not violating antitrust, or we're not your workers and you're effectively creating a price cartel over what we can charge per ride. So what that spotlighted again is that these companies, there's no central principle, there's no central ideology, there's no central viewpoint about what an employer and an employee is. The only thing that connects all of these things together is that the company is trying to evade as many responsibilities as possible.
Right. And Uber is a good example because they don't want to have to pay for the car, for the gas, for any damage that possibly happens. Amazon, another absolute master of misclassification and subcontracting. Contractors that have subcontractors. People in the warehouse you might think they're Amazon employees, you might call them Amazon employees, but you'd find out that they actually work for a 3-layer down subcontractor, and that's on the logistics side, the driver's side, and elsewhere. As you Daily Poster also, wrote recently about an Amazon effort to fight against efforts by workers to bring about a little bit more safety into the workplace. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. So the New York pension funds, led by New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer, put forward a pretty simple shareholder resolution. The pension funds own about 500,000 shares of stock of Amazon, and every year companies have their annual meetings where shareholders are allowed to bring forward initiatives to ask other shareholders to vote on it, because the shareholders are the owners of the company, asking the shareholders to vote on various policies that they want to see implemented at the company. So Scott Stringer, on behalf of New York pension funds, brought forward a shareholder resolution, simply asking Amazon's management to more transparently detail how, and really if, they have taken adequate steps to protect Amazon's workers from the pandemic. And they put forward this very simple resolution. And in the supporting material for the resolution, they said, look, there's all sorts of evidence that you actually haven't protected employees, and this is a problem for the shareholder value of the company. They made a sort of an argument that, making sure our workers can work and stay healthy is actually a shareholder value issue. And what Amazon did in response to this was Amazon went to the now Biden Securities and Exchange Commission and asked the SEC to bless its move to eliminate this shareholder initiative from the ballot. That at the annual meetings, these companies put forward a ballot where shareholders are allowed to vote on these initiatives, the initiatives that qualify. But what Amazon is trying to do is trying to prevent even a vote from happening. They went to the SEC and said, listen, our plan is to not even include this on the shareholder ballot. And we want the SEC to bless this move. And the reason companies want, when in these kinds of situations, want the SEC to block this move, these kinds of moves, and to bless it, is because they're afraid that if they don't put the shareholder initiative on the ballot, that they'll get sued by shareholders for violating basic securities laws. So the idea is if the SEC says it's okay, then you can effectively block it without having to worry that you're going to get sued. So that's what Amazon is asking the SEC. And Amazon is basically, what's interesting is they've said two things in defense of, in their rationale. They've said, one, we're already facing lawsuits over our treatment of workers. So even having to publicly detail how we've treated our workers and whether we've protected them may complicate those lawsuits. And they've also said that
the Trump defense, I'm getting audited, so
yes, exactly.
I'd love to share my taxes, but
exactly. And then their other defense is this would interfere with so-called normal business operations. And there's a long-standing SEC rule that says essentially shareholders cannot interfere with day-to-day business. But again, all these pension funds are asking for is a simple report. Just tell us what you've actually been doing. So to my mind, the fact that Amazon didn't just say, okay, look, here's everything we've done. The fact that Amazon doesn't even want this to be voted on really begs the question, like, what are you trying to hide? Like, like clearly there's something you don't want to say. And that to me is sort of the smoking gun.
And one of their problems with transparency is that whenever they do come forward with some claim, it's refuted often by Ken Klippenstein or somebody over at the Daily Poster within hours or days, because they turn over staff so fast that they have not created any loyalty. There's some loyalty among the executive class, but it's a famously vile kind of toxic corporate culture as well, where people are just driven into dust. There have been a couple interesting articles about that. Obviously, they're compensated much better than their warehouse colleagues, so it's not remotely comparable. But it does go to the loyalty that people have. And so as soon as Amazon makes a claim publicly, if that claim isn't true, the public's going to learn it within 12 hours, because either an ex-worker has the documentation to prove it wrong, or somebody who doesn't mind soon being an ex-worker is happy to share it because they're just so out outraged at their bosses over that. Have you what experience have you had reporting on Amazon over at Daily Post or?
Well, I mean, we've done a lot on their filings on sort of we do a lot of document based reporting, and you know, it's interesting. Just as a general rule, I would encourage folks who are listening to this to take some time to read, you know, stuff like 10K filings, stuff like shareholder resolutions. You know, what's interesting is that I think people don't know about it, and frankly, it is kind of buried on the SEC's website. I'm sure that's just a coincidence, but there's a fascinating piece of the SEC's website where it's just a log of all of the incoming shareholder resolutions and then the detailed responses that the companies then put forward to the SEC. And in their detailed responses, you know, they say all sorts of things. And the important thing to know is that what they're saying to the SEC officially, like under the law, those things have to be accurate. You can't I mean, I'm sure regulators get lied to a lot, but the point is that lying to a regulator is technically not legal. So the point being that when you read Amazon's correspondence, I mean, for instance, as an example, last year they blocked a similar resolution, a similar worker safety resolution at the very beginning of the COVID outbreak. And, you know, they basically argued that, hey, we're already implementing all sorts of safety measures. So this shareholder resolution doesn't need, is sort of, we've already substantially implemented what this resolution is asking. Now, I would argue that obviously that wasn't the case, right? I mean, we've seen, you know, just this week, NBC News reported that there have been so many complaints at the NLRB over safety, over mistreatment of workers, that they may package them all together into one mega case. So obviously, Amazon had not substantially implemented a basic request for the company to better respect union organizing rights and protect worker safety. So it's always important to read what these companies are saying to their investors. I mean, it was Elizabeth Warren, by the way, who a couple of years ago put together a really fantastic report in which she essentially contrasted what companies were saying, these is not Amazon, but other companies, were saying about, I think it was the fiduciary rule, a rule to basically make sure companies better treat investors, you know, regular rank and file investors, that they were saying one thing in public, like, oh my God, this rule is going to destroy our whole business. And then to regulators, in comments to regulators, they were saying, actually, you know, this rule won't really hurt our business all that much. And the point is that the discrepancy between what they say publicly and what they say to the regulators, essentially, if those two things are different, they're lying to one set of people. And if they're lying to regulators, that is a really serious problem. So all that's a long way of saying, I encourage anybody who's interested in Amazon and its business practices to really take a look at its SEC filings, to really take a look at how it responds to these kinds of resolutions.
We got a couple minutes left before I let you go. Before we went on air, you and I were talking about Ghostbusters. And yes, it may seem like there's no segue there, but it is about the ideology that undergirds all of this. You were making a point about the message in the main part of the first movie. This is 1984, the height of the Reagan era. That stuck out to you, and it stuck out to me too.
Yeah, so I wrote a book back in 2011 called Back to Our Future, which was all about the messages that were embedded in 1980s pop culture, the political messages that were embedded in 1980s pop culture. And just to be clear, I don't think there was like a smoky back room where Hollywood producers kind of decided, hey, we're going to use, you know, pop culture to indoctrinate people. I don't think that's how really, you know, kind of entertainment pop culture really works. Oftentimes entertainment pop culture is simply reflecting back the kind of cultural norms.
It's just in the ether. Right.
Yes, exactly. And so if you really think about what the movie, for instance, Ghostbusters was saying, And it's very relevant to today and how we think about government, because arguably we are coming to the end, hopefully, knock on wood, the end of what we commonly understand to be the Reagan era. The Reagan era, one of the major themes of the Reagan era is, quote, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help," are some of the most dangerous words in the English language. The idea being the Reagan era is an era that was extremely anti-government. And if you watch the movie Ghostbusters, if you really think about what that story is about, that the central villain of that story is an EPA administrator. The central heroes of that story are private contractors, arguably private military contractors. And in the crescendo moment of the movie, the EPA villain comes in and forces the private company to shut down essentially its ghost protective grid, which then basically blows up the city. And by the way, who has to then save the city? The mayor, the public official, the public sector says, look, I don't know how to save the city. The military can't save the city. The only people who can really save the city are the private military contractors, not the government. Yeah. So what's really interesting to think about and I want to be clear, I'm a fan of Ghostbusters. I love that movie. Like, I'm not trying to be like super over serious about it, but it's always interesting to think about what the political messages of the pop culture products, what those messages were, what they were sending to children. And one last point about this, why it's so important. These messages are important because when you watch a political television ad, you're watching a political television ad. So your kind of filter is up. You're sort of being preached to, or they're trying to indoctrinate you. Dwight Eisenhower, many decades ago, when he was talking about trying to essentially propagandize to the Soviet population, he in one letter basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's much more effective to do it through pop cultural products, the arts, books, literature, newspapers, and the like, rather than through overtly kind of 1984 style Orwellian propaganda. And so it's always interesting to think about the movies, the TV shows, the cartoons that we watched as kids, and what messages they were sending us. Political messages that, again, may not have been like, a conspiracy theory, but were certainly creating the ways in which we think about things. And Ghostbusters, to me, it's like the perfect example.
Right, and we're not canceling Ghostbusters tonight. But people should go to YouTube and go watch that clip, because when I watched it with my kids about a year ago, rewatched it after watching it as a kid, I was like, wow, this EPA guy is a real jerk. Well, he is the worst guy in this movie. This is quite a message. David Sirota, thanks so much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat, emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.